Welcome, everybody. I know a few more people are still joining in as I speak, but I'm just so glad that you're all here. And I'm so grateful that we have this opportunity to be with Ambassador Gary Grappo. I'm going to say a few words about Ambassador Grappo, and then we're going to dive right in because I want to make the best use of our time. First of all, I'm so grateful, Gary, to you. Just the miracle of technology. This past weekend, I went to visit my mother-in-law, and I was on the flight home, and I thought, wouldn't it be great if we could get Gary to come and speak to our congregation about what's going on in the Ukraine? And I was texting you from 30,000 feet in the air. Gary got right back to me and said, I'd be happy to help. Some of you remember when Ambassador Grappo spoke to us a few years back. We had him in person, which was great. We had a chance to have a conversation about the Iran nuclear deal back in, I think, 2016 or so. And now we're online, but hopefully, God willing, we'll have you back at the congregation one of these days soon. Gary is a former U.S. ambassador and a distinguished fellow at the Center for Middle East Studies at the Korbel School for International Studies at the University of Denver. He has almost 40 years of experience as a diplomat, as a public policy expert in a variety of public and private nonprofit endeavors as well. Been part of the senior foreign service of the United States Department of State. He was the envoy and head of mission of the Office of the Quartet. And we're going to talk about that, working directly with Mr. Tony Blair in Jerusalem. And that's where I got to meet Gary and his family. He's had senior positions in the U.S. State Department, including Minister Counselor for Political Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, U.S. Ambassador to the Sultanate of Oman, Charge d'Affaires and Deputy Chief of Mission of the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and lots of other things we're going to learn about over the course of our conversation. He was the president and the CEO after leaving the State Department of the Keystone Center. And now he's currently also, in addition to his teaching responsibilities, the CEO of Equilibrium International Consulting. But I know him as an incredibly warm and wonderful person who also, when my family was living in Jerusalem and it was time for Halloween and my daughters wanted to have some Halloween fun, do you remember, Gary, you got me a pumpkin because it wasn't so easy to get pumpkins. But somehow the State Department made sure that you got, why did they send you guys pumpkins, by the way? Was it just so you could have a sense of being back in America?
Yes, and of course, no one celebrates Halloween like the crazy Americans do, carving pumpkins of all things. And so, yes, we managed to get our hands on some, and happy to share those with you and your family.
Well, I'm grateful for that. And more importantly, I'm grateful for the opportunities we had to break bread together and spend time together and getting to know you and Becky and your generosity was all the way back then because I invited Ambassador Grappo to come and speak to the Hebrew Union College students right when you were leaving the quartet. And you told us, you said this is a great time to have me come because I'm leaving the State Department and I haven't started my next job yet. So I think I can say more to you than I'll be able to say at any other moment in my life. And you shared with us that situation. But I wanted to ask you about, I mentioned in your bio the experience that you had in the Middle East, in Baghdad, in Saudi Arabia, in Oman, and then in Jerusalem, a very extensive experience there. But you also spent a lot of time working on the Soviet and the Russia desk. Tell us a little bit about that chapter in your career, because it's a really interesting time span. It kind of went through the fall of the Soviet Union.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, Yoshi, thank you so much for reaching out to me. It's a real pleasure to join you this evening and to speak with members of the congregation. And indeed, before I ever served posting in the Middle East in the State Department in Washington, I was assigned to what was then known as the Office of Soviet Union Affairs. It was actually an enormous office for the State Department, over 40 diplomats and specialists on the Soviet Union. And I joined, boy, timing is everything, in 1990 and was given a fairly nondescript portfolio dealing with various types of economic affairs in the Soviet Union, but really got into it because almost within months of my arrival there, we began to get word through a variety of sources of an impending famine in the Soviet Union because of a dramatic drop in the expected grain harvest. And so I went over there on numerous missions. This actually got White House attention. President Bush dispatched a group of us over to look at ways to help the Soviets. We were very concerned about political instability right at the time that we were forging warmer ties with Gorbachev and the Soviet Union. We didn't want to see this political unrest as a result of a famine. So I got to, I was there throughout the fall of the Soviet Union. And then in the aftermath, when we started reaching out to form relations with each of the individual republics, including Ukraine, and visited Ukraine a number of times, as well as Russia, some of the other republics. And that period actually has considerable bearing, at least on the mindset of Vladimir Putin today. And perhaps we can touch on that at some point in our conversation.
Thank you. Absolutely, we will. I wanted to ask you another question that relates to your work with, in this case, Russia, because it happened a little bit later and the Soviet Union was no more. But when you were working with the quartet in Jerusalem, and for folks who might not remember that period, there were four, as the name suggests, there were four entities working on coming to some type of solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict: the European Union, the United States of America, Great Britain, and Russia. And
actually, Great Britain wasn't on it. It was the UN.
Sorry. America, EU, UN, and Russia. Right. I was thinking of Great Britain because Tony Blair was helping during the period that you worked directly with him as his chief of staff. So the current Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, was part of that conversation around the quartet. So you worked closely with him. I read in the news today that he's on a list of people that apparently are going to be brought up on war crimes charges in his current role as foreign minister. I don't know where that will go, but tell us about him and about your work with him, and perhaps some of the other Russian leaders that you interfaced with in your time with the quartet.
The Russians did not show a great amount of interest in this issue. At one time, they had posted someone ostensibly a diplomat to the quartet, because we had diplomats and development specialists from a variety of countries, even as far afield as New Zealand, quite a few of the European countries. I was one of only 2 Americans, and I was the head of the mission. And the one Russian there contributed pretty close to zero. And there was a strong suspicion that he was there just to collect intelligence. And I think some subtle messages were sent. He was withdrawn and never replaced. Fortunately, in my interactions with the foreign minister, he's very polished, very astute, a very clever representative of the interest of Russia, but without question, 100% a cipher for the leadership. And in this case, that's only Vladimir Putin, without question. And the role that he has played in this conflict is totally consistent with the perceptions that I had about him 20 odd years ago. But nevertheless comes across as very polished, very urbane. He must buy his suits in Italy, certainly a lot better than the ones I ever wore. But without question, pretty much loyal to his master. I think you're still muted.
Thank you. I've only been on Zoom now for 2 years, and I keep forgetting to do that. One of the questions that I think a lot of us have right now is, how did we get here? Why are we, the world, and why is Ukraine more specifically in this situation? How do you understand the way we got to this moment?
It's I would say superficially, we might want to attribute February 24th, the day that the Russians invaded Ukraine as the start of this conflict. But in fact, it goes back 15 years. In 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, this is probably the best known international security conference anywhere in the world. It's conducted every year in February. They just finished it up not quite a month ago. And it's attended by top political figures, diplomats, military leaders, and think tank folks from all over the world. Vladimir Putin in 2007 spoke at the conference and delivered a very, very sobering and indeed shocking speech to the attendees at that conference. First of all, he lambasted the United States for invasion of Iraq. Okay, he probably had the support of the majority of the people at the conference on that one. But more importantly, he quickly segued into the aggression of NATO since the fall of the Soviet Union, surrounding and encroaching upon the borders and threatening Russia, and drew a very firm line at that conference, saying that he would no longer tolerate NATO expansion into the borders of and across the borders to include the states of the former Soviet bloc. And said that Russia had been lied to and betrayed by specifically the United States, but NATO in general, with its expansion, and really shocked the attendees. People were literally gobsmacked to hear him speak in such harsh tones about NATO. Of course, he gave this speech in Munich, Germany. So John McCain, the deceased senator, got up and spoke shortly afterwards to offer a rebuttal that was unprepared, defending the United States and NATO for what we had done and giving the reasons why we had done it. And also pointedly remarking that no promise had ever been made to any Russian official with respect to NATO expansion. It has always been a part of the NATO Charter that membership would be open to any European nation, to include, by the way, Russia. And that it would be any decision regarding membership would be a decision for all of NATO and not just one country, namely the US. So it was a pretty strong rebuttal, but the line was really drawn. War was effectively declared then. And it got progressively worse. In 2008, of course, we know that he sent troops into Georgia under similar circumstances to what we now see in eastern Ukraine, with a strong Russian-backed separatist movement in two areas in the north of Georgia, Ossetia and Abkhazia. And after a very short, intense, but bloody war, the Georgians effectively caved, and now that area is occupied by these separatists and is recognized by Russia only as independent republics. And of course, last week, before he invaded Ukraine proper, he did exactly the same thing with the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk. And he followed that in 2014, of course, with his invasion and annexation of Crimea. And then within a few months of that, the public backing and direct support for the separatists in the Donbass. And so Ukrainians have been at war with Russia, specifically Vladimir Putin, since 2014. But Vladimir Putin has been at war against the West, and that's truly what this is. He has gone to war against the West and everything it stands for: democracy, liberty, rule of law, and representative and accountable government. And he is less fearful of NATO forces than he is of a democratic movement on his borders, especially when he knows that there's growing disaffection among his own population for the government that Russia has today.
So that's so helpful to give us the context and have a sense of how far this goes back. Some have said, well, if President Obama had only done this, if President Trump had only done this, if President Biden had only done this, are there things that, when you look back on it as a career diplomat, you feel that we could have, should have done differently?
Well, we clearly could have taken a stronger position in 2008 when he invaded Georgia. But of course, we were distracted by two wars, one in Iraq and one in Afghanistan. And so we did very little. George Bush effectively almost looked the other way. And then in 2014, although we took some action in terms of the application of sanctions on Russia, they were not nearly strong enough, clearly, in hindsight, which is why I think under President Biden, the US, as well as all of our European allies and countries around the world, are taking much, much stronger action in the application of sanctions on Russia, Russian entities and organizations and individuals.
And during the Trump years, there was this interesting dynamic between Trump and Putin, and there were all sorts of questions people asked about what is that relationship, and does Putin have something on Trump, and what's it all about? I'm not asking you to psychoanalyze that relationship, but when you think about sort of the American posture towards Russia during that presidency, what do you make of it? What could we have done differently? Obviously, there was the phone call, the famous phone call with Ukraine, where there seemed to be a political pressure being applied. Does that play into all of this, or do you feel like the die was already cast, like you said, going all the way back to Munich?
Well, regardless, I think the die had been cast. I don't think there was any question there. But I think certainly the approach that Trump took in his dealings with Russia and specifically Putin, and seemingly backing, not seemingly, he backed off supporting NATO, it really played again to this framework that Putin has of the West, that it's weak, that it won't take action, that under pressure, strong, tough, Vladimir Putin type of macho pressure, that the West and the US would cave. And clearly that's what Trump seemed to be doing. And of course, Mr. Trump is no longer with us in the White House, but all of that played into this mindset that the West is weak, they won't stand up, they won't resist. And that's one of the mistakes, one of many he's made in his invasion of Ukraine.
And just a question about Afghanistan. Obviously, just a little bit ago, the United States withdrew, and there's been a lot of criticism of the way it happened and the timing of it, and should it have happened. Do you think, again, in some ways I feel like I'm asking the same question, because if the die was cast, the die was cast. Putin was waiting for the opportunity to do this, and he was going to seize that opportunity, in which case it didn't matter how we withdrew from Afghanistan and when we withdrew from Afghanistan. But some have argued that that was just another thing that showed that the West is weak. We're not going to stand by those people that we purport to be their allies, and it provided a broader opening. Thoughts about that?
It, without question, confirmed this frame of mind or outlook of Putin regarding specifically the United States, but the West in general, that it doesn't have the staying power, it's not willing to do the necessary. If you look at the way Putin has waged his conflicts, even going back to 1999 when he was dealing with a very restive Chechnya, he got tough, and he gave the residents of Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, less than a 24-hour notice to get out of Dodge, and then proceeded to level the city, decimated it. There were probably more civilian casualties than there were military. And this is the approach that he has taken. When Russia intervened in the Syria civil war, there was a very strong presence of the resistance movement in Aleppo, up in the northern part, and he pulled out his Grozny playbook and proceeded to bombard the city of Aleppo, one of the most historic cities in the world, certainly in the Middle East, and turn it into rubble. I think it has 2 UN heritage sites that are no longer standing, and had given the civilians there very little warning. And now we're seeing a new strategy of his forces in Ukraine after their first seemed to fall wanting, to employ massive air assault and missile strikes on not only just military targets, but civilian targets, civilian government buildings, residential areas, schools, and so forth. He takes very little stock at all in humanitarian concerns. When he sets his mind to achieving an objective, there are no qualifications. He's going for it, and that's exactly what he is doing, unfortunately, in Ukraine.
Have you had an opportunity, with all of the connections that you've had through your time at the quartet and before, what's your experience of Putin himself? And what can you tell us? A lot of people describe him right now as, a madman who's unhinged. Others have said, no, he's he's being very strategic and tactical. And this is something that he's been wanting to achieve for quite some time now. He wants to reconstitute the USSR, and he's doing it in a kind of methodical way. What's your sense of him as a man, as a leader? What can you tell us about those experiences that you had with him in his inner circle?
He's very calculating. Heretofore, he's been very strategic, very purposeful. But one of the shortcomings of an authoritarian, of having been in power for so long, as he ends up surrounding himself with individuals who will not challenge him and don't always feed him the truth. And if they do, they probably don't last long, or he doesn't accept it. He has become very self-assured in his perceptions of the world and Russia's place in it, I would say, to the point of being arrogant, and therefore believes that his vision is the way forward, and is not willing to listen. And the clearest example of that, Yoshi, was a couple of weeks ago when he assembled the senior members of his cabinet in this spacious white marble room. It was televised. You can go to BBC or YouTube and you can see that. And this was an event scripted, directed, produced by Putin, with him as the main star. And these individual cabinet members, you could see all of them were very, very nervous. I've read observations of psychiatrists looking at their body language and positions and so forth, extremely nervous, and all basically praising his wisdom and his courage and his foresight, and unwilling to challenge. And that's probably a reflection not only of the public person that we see, but the private as well. And just to underscore that, he has we're all fearful of COVID, of course. We all take precautions to prevent it. His is over-the-top fear, which is why you see him at these meetings sitting at opposite ends from these tables that almost look like that make a ping pong table look like your coffee table. And it's because he is so fearful of contracting COVID. He has self-isolated himself and only meets with a very, very few of his senior leadership, and that's only after they go through rigorous testing. Of course, the Russian vaccines have been proven ineffective against the more recent variants of COVID. And folks have started to wonder about perhaps the development of a certain bunker mentality, where he may be, and then this is really speculating, focusing himself on his future and his place in the history of Russia, and creating or recreating the Russian Empire, Tsarist Russia. And I mean, these are sort of speculations that are out there, but you really have to wonder about the mindset of someone who's been in office for almost 23 years, who is never challenged today, and about the information that he's been getting. And I think, at least from what we can see of this conflict now, 9 days into it, the miscalculations that this very careful leader seems to have made.
Some people wonder, well, is it possible that that within the Russian leadership there would be some sort of coup? There would be, Russian intelligence would say he's out of touch with what's actually happening. We're losing soldiers in the Ukraine. We're certainly losing the public relations war. These sanctions, there are questions that people have put in the chat about the sanctions. Is there a chance that they can really effectuate the kind of change that we want? Well, what do you think, first of all, about the possibility that that within Russia there would be forces that could somehow either pull Putin back and somehow help him to be more reasonable, or topple him on the one hand, and then the other question just about the effectiveness of sanctions, and can we get there that way, or do we need to actually wage a war against him?
I would say very, very low probability of removing Putin in any way, shape, or form. He's surrounded by these loyalists, and to take action against him in any fashion would require an enormous amount of collaboration and communication and support among his most senior advisors, including military officers, and then, of course, getting enough of a force to physically remove him from office. And I don't see that happening. I wouldn't exclude it entirely, but a very low probability. Similarly, I don't think Vladimir Putin is willing to accept defeat in Ukraine. That somehow you reach a certain point and it's clear that they can't achieve the kind of victory that he wants, that he simply declares victory and goes home and has proven the mettle of great Russia. No, he wants Ukraine. If not in its entirety, certainly a significant portion of it. I'd say at the very least that almost eastern half up to the Dnieper River. And I don't think he's going to back down. Now, you mentioned the sanctions, and it's very important that we note sanctions. If anyone expects sanctions to start having an impact today or even next week or next month, I have bad news for them. That's not the way sanctions work. Sanctions are meant to take their toll over a much longer period of time. I will say that we have never seen a level of sanctions on a country, not even Iran, that we're seeing now being placed on Russia, particularly with respect to its banking and financial system. Russia is effectively been disconnected from the global financial system, and this will ultimately wreak havoc. And the government is going to pay with reduced revenues, and ultimately the Russian people will pay too. We've seen, well, they closed the stock market after the precipitous fall, shortly after the invasion and the implementation of sanctions. The ruble declined by 30 or 40%, and now they stopped trading in Russia on the ruble because fear of further declines. Individual Russians can no longer withdraw hard currency from accounts they had in banks. Banks can no longer access any hard currency. Putin was extremely proud of the fact that he thought he prepared Russia by building up Russia's foreign exchange reserves. They got hit very, very hard in 2014 from those sanctions after the invasion of Crimea. And so since then, he's been building up his reserves to $630 billion. Now, I always ask this question. I was talking to my students. Of course, they don't have a lot of assets, but you ask someone, okay, think in your mind the total value of assets you have. You got your home, your car, maybe you got property, you got investments, and bank accounts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then you ask, what percentage of your assets is represented by the money you have in your pocket, your wallet, or your purse? People would say, well, a fraction. I got it in bank accounts. That's what Russia did. Although I don't think Putin was aware of that. So of the $630 billion in foreign reserves that he built up, he does have it. Only $12 billion in actual cash resides in the central bank of Russia in Moscow.
Wow.
400 billion of it is in accounts in 5 capitals, or almost capitals: London, New York, Paris, Berlin, and Tokyo, and then a few other scattered ones, but the bulk of it in those 5. And he can't, his account has been effectively frozen.
Wow.
He has another 80 billion in gold, but gold, it doesn't buy food on the table. The only thing he could do, and no one will buy his gold from him now because of sanctions. The only country that will exchange currency for his gold will be China. But of course, he has to accept renminbi, which is good for buying stuff from China and nothing else. So that $630 billion is really not available to him. And this will take a dramatic toll, not only on the government itself, but on individual Russians and their economic well-being. Shutting down of businesses, businesses withdrawing from Russia. We now are hearing of oil tanker companies refusing to carry Russian oil, and grain shipping companies, these are foreign companies, obviously, unwilling to ship Russian grain. I'm not sure I feel particularly comfortable with that, because that could present pretty severe food shortages in a lot of countries in the world who rely on both Ukraine and Russia for their grain imports. But we're seeing this cascade of those severe sanctions, and there will be more to come. And so this is going to have a very dramatic impact on their economy. I'm predicting within a month to 6 weeks, you will see a recession. And if it goes this long, 4 to 6 months, a depression in Russia, because they are totally, almost entirely cut off from the global financial and economic system.
And your sense of Putin and how badly he wants the Ukraine, and how he holds on to power in such a totalitarian way, even if they go into a depression, even if his people are starving, even if there's famine throughout Russia, will that accomplish what we want it to accomplish, or will it just lead to the suffering of millions and millions of Russians?
I would find it hard to believe that he could ignore that. I also suspect that if and when it reaches that point, that everyday Russians will become much more proactive. Today, of course, what we're hearing about scattered demonstrations where people are going out and taking a risk, and it is a grave risk in Russia today. There's talk of imposition of martial law, which will make it difficult, but it's a reflection of the fear that Putin has of public unrest in his own country, which would force him to divert his attention from the war in Ukraine to quelling unrest in his own country. But it is a distinct possibility as things worsen in Russia, which they most definitely will. But it is dependent on a couple of things, and this is where there are some positive signs. And I don't want to I don't want to sugarcoat this at all. But because the odds are still against Ukraine. I mean, let's be honest. However, what has impressed the whole world and surprised Putin and the Russians is the strength of the Ukrainian army and the resiliency and resolve of the Ukrainian people. And the longer this goes, if they can keep that up, and very importantly, NATO and other European countries will continue to channel aid, support, weapons, and materiel to the Ukrainians. Because what they've shown us today is that as long as they have what they need to fight, they will fight. They'll resist. They're willing to defend their country. And that is the strongest component in this. And that will drain not only the supplies, which already have presented challenges to the Russians. Their logistics planning does not appear to be very, very good. I mean, we did a much better job doing our wars 8,000 miles away. They did not in a country next door. And so they've already stretched their supply lines. And those lines are going to be even further depressed as they come under attack from Ukrainians, including private militias that are armed by the Ukrainian army or armed by the West, and also trained, I might add. And as the sanctions take their toll and Russians are less able to purchase or manufacture the war material needed to pursue the war in Ukraine. But this is going to require a lot of toughness on the part of the Ukrainian people. Wars of this type over the last, however many years you want to track it, certainly the last 20 years are not short wars. Iraq and Afghanistan, two cases in point. Think about the American involvement in Vietnam. This takes a while. On the other hand, wars of conquest by major powers to recreate empires, which is what he's trying to do here, in fact, never succeed. Britain, France, Italy, Belgium, Portugal, you name them. They pursued long wars and their former colonies against indigenous opposition. And indigenous opposition invariably has proven that they have the will to outlast invaders and occupiers. And so in that respect, history is on the side of the Ukrainians, but they have to hang in there. They have to press the fight, which by all appearances, they seem more than prepared to do. And I have to say, and I don't think anyone can be unimpressed with what their president has done. Zelensky, who's gone from a comedian to president to now, the George Washington or the Abraham Lincoln of Ukraine. It's truly, he brings a unique set of talents and skills that has enabled him to rally the Ukrainians to the defense of their nation and to embrace him, when, by the way, his popularity a month ago was spiraling. So it's truly amazing.
Yeah, it's been wonderful to watch, and certainly the Jewish community has taken great pride in his leadership and his use of social media. I mean, he's very adept at that. His humor, his resolve, how quick he's been on his feet. I was reading about his family today, and his great-grandfather was killed by the Nazis in the Holocaust, and many of his great uncles were murdered by the Nazis. His father survived, fought in the Red Army, against Hitler. And it's a story. I served 11 years, and this is how I came to know you, ambassadors, through my connection to the congregation in Los Altos Hills that I used to serve because of a mutual friend. And that community had a very large immigrant population. And so I got to spend a lot of time with people of, Zelensky's father and grandfather's age. Ukrainians, Jews from the Ukraine, from Moldova, from Belarus, from Russia. And to hear these stories, I'll just say that when it comes to grit and resilience and toughness, I would bet on Ukraine in that regard because with a leader who's not willing to capitulate and with the people that has demonstrated that they can go through some tough times and make it to the other side. I want to get to a few questions that have come from some of our participants. I also know that at one point you wanted me to bring a map up, so I'm ready to do that whenever you want. But there's been a couple of questions about nuclear weapons. One is, if there's an escalation and Putin, feels like he's in a corner or something like that, will he potentially use nuclear weapons? Should we, the West, be threatening back in some ways? Obviously nobody wants a nuclear war. And also a question about promises that the West seems to have made to Ukraine years and years ago, so that they would set aside their nuclear arsenal because they possessed nuclear weapons. And there was a promise that, but if you ever need us, we'll be there for you. And they did so. They got rid of their nuclear arsenal. And are we really going to be there for them today? So I guess two questions. One is how do we prevent this from becoming a nuclear conflict? And should we even go there in terms of our willingness to support Ukraine? And then secondly, that question about the Ukrainian nuclear arsenal that was set aside with the promise that the West would be there for them.
I think Putin's statement regarding nuclear weapons was a blunt message, unnecessary one, but very blunt, that if Russia's direct interests were threatened by NATO, that he would be willing to resort to nuclear weapons. I don't think that applies to the current conflict in Ukraine, and as long as NATO stays out, I'm referring to their military forces, then I think the likelihood of that is slim to zero. But we have to keep in mind, in the fog of war, errors, miscalculations happen, escalation happens, and if an errant rocket or missile were to land in Poland, perhaps taking the lives of some Poles, or perhaps the shoot down of a NATO aircraft, then we're into another level of this conflict, much, much different, and probably the one that we'd least want to see, and that is a NATO-Russia conflict. And right now, the probability of that seems low. Most of the conflict seems confined to area up around Ukraine, up around Kiev, and down in the south and to the east. Not a whole lot of activity to the west, some, but not a great amount. So low probability there. On the second question, which was on the
Ukrainian nuclear arsenal,
yes,
set aside with sort of a promise that we'd be there for them if it ever came to that.
The promise was that the West and Russia would respect Ukraine's borders and sovereignty, this to include the Donbass and Crimea. Russia certainly violated that. To the extent that we would be there, that we never promised that we would deploy military forces to defend Ukraine. They would have to be a member of NATO before they could receive that level of support. But I think what the United States and our European allies are trying to do is provide the Ukrainians for the wherewithal they need to defend themselves. And granted, it's not the same thing, because a war against Ukraine is not the same as a war against NATO. A war against NATO, Putin knows he'd be vastly outnumbered, outgunned, and out-resourced in every way, and he'd be a fool. But there is some possibility, and while on the subject, if he were to achieve the victory he wants in Ukraine, we should not deceive ourselves, because the war he declared in 2007, in my view, would continue. He does have a vision of recreating the Great Russian, the Tsarist Empire, and would certainly have his eye on Poland. But I think the easier targets would be the Baltics. And if you wouldn't mind, Yoshi, calling up that map, because I wanted to call the group's attention to the particular vulnerability the Baltics have. you'll note the three Baltic states up there toward the top of the map, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And then as you move south from Lithuania to Poland, there is a very tiny stretch of common border between Poland and Lithuania. That is the only land bridge between Poland and the rest of NATO and the Baltic states, who are, of course, also NATO members. The Russians have, they say, 100,000 troops in Kaliningrad, which is that wedged enclave to the left of your arrow. That's Kaliningrad. They say they have 100,000. There are estimates that they may have actually as many as 200,000 troops, to include naval forces and air forces and missile, including nuclear capable missiles in Kaliningrad. It is armed to the teeth. Meanwhile, we know they have at least 30,000.
Is this part, this section right here?
That is part of Russia.
That's part of Russia. Okay.
That is Russia, sovereign Russian territory, Kaliningrad.
So this border, you're talking about this border with Poland and this border with Lithuania.
No, I'm talking about just that corridor that is a direct connection between Poland and Lithuania, not through Kaliningrad.
Okay, right here.
Because that area, it's only, depending on how you measure it, about 40 to 50 miles long. And it's flat land, scattered farmland, rolling hills. It's sort of the classic kind of terrain that you would expect in a 19th century battle or a 20th century armored battle between tanks. Flat, level, easy to maneuver, and move fast. And like I said, it's the only land bridge between the Baltics and the rest of NATO. And if he were to strike against the Baltics, probably the first place he would head is the Suwalki Gap, which is what that area is known as, Suwalki Gap. Keep your eyes on that, because otherwise Lithuania is surrounded, of course, has a large border with Belarus, which is most definitely in the Russian camp. Then if you move further up, Latvia and Estonia both share borders with Russia, and all three of the Baltics have sizable Russian populations. So if he were to make a move against NATO, in my estimation, it would be against the Baltics. Poland might be too much to try and bite off and chew. There's a sizable NATO presence, force presence in Poland, and Poland has sizable armed forces itself. And they've been in NATO for quite a while, and perfectly capable of defending themselves, and most definitely with the support of the rest of NATO. So this is something to keep our eyes on if he decides to act on some greater ambitions of his. Thanks for sharing that, Matt.
Oh, you got it. And thank you for walking us through that. That was really helpful. There was a question about the Iron Dome defenses that the United States has supported Israel with. And, would it be possible to provide the Ukrainians with some of these defense systems so that they could thwart Russian missile attacks?
In the near term, no, because you'd really have to ramp up production. And so, we'd be talking, if we decided to do that a year from now, before we would get the requisite number of Iron Dome systems into Ukraine, but most definitely in terms of combating the missile strikes that Ukraine is now being subjected to. What we're focusing on, particularly since we expect a considerable amount of ground fighting to take place, and then the Russians to employ their armor, is these shoulder-fired rockets known as Harpoon. They're not Harpoon. All of a sudden, the name is escaping me. But they're shoulder-fired, and they're extremely effective against the Russian tanks.
Are they Stinger missiles?
No, the Stinger are also shoulder-fired, but they go after aircraft.
Okay.
And so those two systems are being sent into Ukraine in significant numbers now, not only by the US, but by our NATO allies, including Germany, I understand Poland is giving them some, and some of the other countries. And so they're going to get a supply of those. And those Stingers, which have been modernized, Javelin, thank you very much, Frank, for doing that. The Stingers have been modernized and are extremely effective and lethal against all types of aircraft, especially helicopters, which the Russians are using in great number. By the way, the Ukrainian Air Force has done a very credible job, despite being vastly outnumbered. Again, one of the mystifying aspects of the invasion is that the Russians did not employ air power in the way we would have done. In the US, the first thing we try to do is take full control of the air. And in every conflict we've been in over the last 25 years, it's the first thing we do. We did it in the Balkans. We did it in Afghanistan, of course, not that there was much of a challenge. In Iraq, same question, or same issue. The Russians didn't do that. And so the Ukrainian Air Force, which has fairly modern aircraft and well-trained pilots, including pilots who've trained in the United States and elsewhere, were pretty effective in taking out some of the ground convoys and troops of the Russians. Now, of course, they are deploying aircraft, and the Ukrainian Air Force is experiencing a much higher loss rate. And so at some point, they are going to need additional aircraft. And of course, the training for pilots. So their needs are only going to increase. And this is where it really is incumbent on the West to be there for the Ukrainians as long as they demonstrate this will and the commitment to fight. And all signs are that they're going to be there, which is encouraging, very encouraging.
Thank you. Just time for a few more questions. One is about the historical analog. People have been talking about, first of all, looking forward in the future, is this going to be World War III, God forbid? But looking backwards, historical analogs to this moment, some have compared Putin's actions to Hitler's in the annexation of the Sudetenland in 1938. What historical parallels do you see in this moment? And do you think that comparison to what Hitler did in Czechoslovakia is apt?
First of all, I have my own personal caveat I don't like to make comparisons to Hitler or World War II. I think that was a sui generis event in world history. Nevertheless, there are some clear parallels here, and it is instructive to point them out. The first is Putin's claim that he needs to protect the Russian people, not only those in Russia, but those outside of Russia's recognized borders. That's what he did in Georgia. It's what he did in Crimea and in the Donbass, and now he's claiming to do in greater Ukraine. And of course, this is exactly what Hitler did with the Sudetenland, even to an extent in Austria, although Austria fell in line pretty quickly with Hitler, and then even in Poland. In fact, after the surrender at Munich by Chamberlain and the German or the Nazis asserting their claim over Czechoslovakia, Hitler made the statement that he had no further claims on European land. Of course, that was laughable in hindsight, we know. It was a lie. And oh, by the way, Putin lies too. Remember, he said there was no invasion. He even told the Russian people there would be no invasion. Every Russian official up to Putin said there would be no invasion. So there is that very, very clear parallel. The second one is the more interesting one, and that is the claim of historical grievance that Hitler used, that humiliation of the German people at Versailles after the end of World War I. They were betrayed by elites who surrendered to the weak West, this great German nation. And he played on that, and he did it very astutely, very cleverly, and of course he won election. This is exactly what Putin has done in referring to the fall of the Soviet Union. He's even gone back and blamed Lenin, of all people, but other communist leaders as well, for this betrayal of the great Russia, to include Ukraine, other former republics. So this historical grievance, which serves as a justification in their minds, in his mind, for the aggression, and this can play favorably in the minds of some of the Russian people. I also note, he referred, when he launched this special military operation, as he called it, in the Ukraine, to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Of course, the Nazis have a very, very special meaning for Russians too. Jews, we all know, but for the Russians too. The Russians suffered enormously during World War II, far more than any other nation, to be perfectly honest, and fought some of the worst and the bloodiest battles of World War II against Germany. And so in the minds of Russians, even today, many years after that conflict, when they think of Nazis, the same sort of hatred and disgust that occurs to all of us is present even more sharply, more fervently among the Russians. And it was well aware that there were anti-Russian Ukrainian nationalists at the time of the German invasion of the Soviet Union. They were Ukrainian nationalists because they had suffered immensely under Stalin. 2 to 3 million Ukrainians died in an intentional famine inflicted on the Ukrainians. And so they were very strongly anti-Russian. They were nationalists. And Putin has cleverly identified the Ukrainians of today with the Nazis of World War II. And of course, there is no resurgence of Nazism in Ukraine whatsoever. Zelensky is a Jew. They had a former prime minister who was a Jew. It's ludicrous. But in the minds of Germans who remember World War II and the suffering they experienced, it does resonate.
Thank you. Last question: if you were advising President Biden, or if you were working with NATO right now, in say a role similar to the role that you had with the quartet, what are some of the things that you would ask them to do? What are some of your recommendations for how we get through this, and ultimately, not just to the other side of this conflict, but hopefully to a better future for Europe and really for the rest of the world?
Couple of things. It was always a low probability, but there was some probability and certainly hope that after the Russians got punched in the nose, and we all remember the famous quote of Mike Tyson, the boxer, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And so the Russian plan had to change dramatically after they were punched in the face in the first phase of this invasion. But the hope of maybe some kind of a short victory on the Ukrainians was always low probability. That's not going to happen. What is the best outcome is one in which the Ukrainians persevere and they are given everything they can possibly use against Russia: war materiel, economic support, humanitarian aid, training in terms of how to conduct militia attacks. We ought to be able to share with them our expertise and what we learned dealing with militias, blowing up our forces in Ukraine and in Iraq and Afghanistan. IEDs and all of the tactics and technology involved in that. All of that can be very usefully employed by the Ukrainians to frustrate the Russians, to drag this conflict out. The Ukrainians have time on their hands. It's the one thing they have. This is their homeland. And so giving them all the wherewithal, and for the West also ensuring that everything that is sanctionable is sanctioned. That basically no funds from the outside, to the extent that we can prevent it, enter Russia and inflict such economic cost, horrendous costs, which will hurt most definitely the Russian people, is done. Because in the end, it will wear down Russia. At some point, they don't have the ability to do all that's necessary to supply those troops. I will also point out that there will be a cost to be borne, and we're seeing it already by ourselves here and by people around the world. We're going to have to pay more at the gasoline pump. It's a small price to pay given what the Ukrainians are doing. And if, oil price today, I just checked, it was up around 108 to 110. If we were to impose sanctions on Russian oil, which ought to be under consideration, I can understand why we might not do it now, but as this drags on and we see further death and devastation inflicted on the Ukrainians, that there'll be greater justification for saying we're cutting off Russia's oil exports. They won't be able to sell oil on the global market. That pretty much dries up almost all the sources of funding they have from the outside. But that will entail us paying a heavy price too at the gas pump. But that's how I see this going in the best of all worlds. Certainly don't want to see a NATO-Russia conflict. And I certainly don't, no one wants to see Putin win this conflict. I don't think the Ukrainians are willing to allow him to do that, but they're going to need our help. And by the way, I think we're largely on the right track in doing all of these things.
Ambassador Grappo, thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate it. And I am looking forward to your next visit to Southern California. We can have you back up at the temple for an in-person conversation. Grateful to you for your service to our nation, and grateful to you for your friendship and for your help tonight in our understanding of this difficult moment.
Not at all, Yoshi. It's a pleasure to do it. It's always great to see you. And thank you so much for the friendship as well. And as I said earlier, I really look forward for my next trip to out to Southern California.
And thank you everybody for joining. We're going to have another conversation next Wednesday with Professor Catherine Stoner of Stanford University. Make sure, please, that you register for that. You can get all of the registration information at wisela.org. There's also on our homepage a link to lots of different ways that you can help provide support through the World Union for Progressive Judaism, through the JDC, through our local federation, through HIAS. There are other opportunities, the JCC in Krakow, Poland, that is helping to bring refugees in. So there's lots of ways that we can help, along with all of the important work that needs to be done by the diplomats and by the political leaders. Thank you, everybody. Good night. Let's pray for a positive outcome. We know it's going to take some time, but let's pray for the positive outcomes that we're hoping for. Thanks, everyone, and thank you, Ambassador.
You bet, Yoshi. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.